Asking Nojaba Nishiki Nindodum Elijah Indigi-Show. I'm here today to talk about can a basket be a comic? I am a two-spirit person from Low Trappers Bay Band, and I have been writing a couple comics, probably not as much as a lot of the people that I look up to and that I've been writing about, and I have done a fair amount of writing on comics so far. But basically what I want to talk about today are the different ways that indigenous ways of creating art and what's considered non-indigenous ways of creating art, how those get categorized and why we categorize ourselves that way sometimes, and how it sort of move beyond that. So first thing I want to talk about is what makes a story. The stories that you have for comics, and well, I'll get to later for the stories we have for baskets, they're different but they're really similar. The biggest difference with that is who gets to tell a certain kind of story. And it's kind of obvious, but when you have someone who's from a really privileged background, they're going to be able to tell a very specific kind of story that it maybe is really important to them, but then a lot of the larger population isn't really going to be able to have that same kind of connection to that story. So the kinds of media that end up getting into, whether it's a movie theater, a comic book shop, even like a tabletop game, those are all going to be generally based around people that have the money and privilege to get their stuff out there because of the way that money makes the world go round right now. So obviously it's not something I want to last forever, but that's what I'm talking about when I say that who gets to make a story. And another part that's really important, and this has been more relevant since pretty much my childhood, and it's been an ongoing thing, but I remember in the 90s there being this big push towards, oh, well, we want to tell these other stories. And it wasn't always for the best reasons. You'd have a lot of conversations around, oh, well, they're telling that story because they want to bring in such and so population to watching it, or oh, this comic is pandering because it has women in it, that sort of thing. So moving beyond the cishet male, like, oh, that's the only stories that are out there. That's always a great thing, but I sort of see both sides when it's like, okay, maybe these weren't always made for the best reasons. But now we have a situation in which there's been a huge upswing in marginalized populations who do want to tell that story. So whereas in the, I believe in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of, and I hate using this word, but anthropologists going around to my tribe to sort of write down some stories, write some papers, get their name out there. Now, those people are still out there. There are definitely still tons of books getting written every year about, like, oh, the mysteries of such and so tribe, but they don't need to be. I mean, they never really needed to be, but now there's no reason for it because we do have our own academics and artists and everything else that are telling those stories. But whose story is it to tell gets into sort of an iffy situation because there are people that are saying, well, I think I'm doing a good enough job because I've maybe had a sensitivity reader, or maybe I did, but I grew up around there. And if that sounds specific, it's because I talked to a specific person that had this argument. So that's what's out there, and that's kind of what we've been dealing with this whole time. And so once we understand that there's only certain people that can tell stories, there's certain stories that get to be told certain ways for certain audiences, then there's a question of, okay, how is that story being told? So that comes down to an arc and plot structure. And anyone that has had to go through an English class is going to know about the plot structure of, you have your starting action, you have your rising action, you have your falling action. The climax was at the rising action, oh, everything's good now, and now it's getting better. But not every story is like that. A lot of conversations certainly aren't like that. And so stories are going to be really dependent on the culture you're coming from. So some conversations that have been being had in indigenous communities are about, like, what kind of stories are we telling? How are we telling them? How do I make a story that is Anishinaabe or whatever other tribe that person is coming from? And so part of that is understanding that you can have a different plot structure. It can be something that doesn't make sense in terms of time frame. What does it mean to make sense in terms of a time frame when you have, like, history books saying colonization ended in blah, blah, blah year, but we're still experiencing it. Where is the end date, and why are we trying to control narratives and control what's happening based on this is over now? So sometimes letting go of the X to Y narrative is really good. Some people really enjoy that for their stories, and I've seen a lot of Indigenous comics sort of moving in that direction of more of a community focus instead of a normal plot structure. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with like telling stories in a way that makes sense to your community, because every community is going to be different. And it's really going to be something that you're doing with your own people to figure out what does that plot structure look like. Because I still don't know what an Anishinaabe plot structure would look like. I have some ideas, I've done some things, but it's still always a learning process, and it's not something you ever do alone. And so moving past that, one of the really important things in my whole methodology around ideas about baskets and comics is community response. So with both of these kinds of art, product, whatever you want to call it, I'm probably just going to start referring to them as art objects. You are never going to start at your making phase. That's not where it begins. So whether you're doing basket weaving and you're starting to make splints and just hammering down the wood itself to make that splint, that is going to be where it starts, given you've already started way back when, learning from teachers, elders, everything else. So there's all these parts that go into it. And it's really similar with comics, where you aren't going to sit down at your desk and start putting the words on. It's so much further behind that, because you've had all of your art classes. If you take art classes, if you're self-taught, you've been teaching yourself. You've been understanding how perspective works, if that's important to what you're doing. You've been learning how to draw plants, how to draw people, and how to put letters together on a page in a way that makes sense to that narrative. So the outcome of all that is that you can't just say, okay, well, this is where it started, because it started before you, and it started way back in your community and whatever that history is. So because of that, there's such an important community response to all of these different objects. So one part of that is your learning, another part is that you're going to be passing on that learning. So entirely different topic along that is that having direction for your story is what makes it a good story. And that's whether you're talking about a basket or a comic. Because with a basket, you're not going to be making up as you go along. The media itself is going to punish you. And as much as I tell myself that, no, I got it, the media itself will punish you with comics too. Whether it's you're going to be overworking, you're going to be going back, you're going to strain your hand, something like that. It's still working the same way. There's a lot of the same ways that different mediums are going to interact with our bodies, and then we have to interact with them. And along those same lines, the final outcome of what we're making, it has to be something that's usable. You have to have that comic get read by people. That entire point is that someone has an experience with what you've made and has hopefully an emotional reaction to it. Hopefully that emotion will at least be, that was kind of fun. And if it's a horror comic, maybe that's not what you want, but you want something out of that. It's not something that has ever been meant to be put in a desk drawer and shoved away. You want something to come out of that relationship that you have with your reader. And so you're going to have a really similar experience with baskets and with basket weaving, where your end goal for this art object has never been that it's going to sit on someone's table or go like on a dresser or just get forgotten, or worst case scenario, somewhere in a museum, not even out, and just sitting and getting dusty somewhere. Because the entire point of that is that whether it's being used to gather berries or medicine, it's supposed to have a community purpose and a community reaction to it. And so part of that I want to go into with museums, I'm going to try to keep myself from going too much of a tangent, because I am going to talk about that later. But with museums, you do have this long-standing issue. Any kind of indigenous media, art, everything else, we have this horrible history with it not being respected, and a lot of that comes from the way that you're supposed to interact with art, which I know I keep doing the hand motion, but sorry, that's just how I am. But with a basket, if a basket is sitting in a museum, it's been separated from its community, there is no community interaction, the usefulness of that object is completely negated. So you have all these baskets that are thirsty, and I did forget to say a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is from an elder in my tribe, Wasan, who does a lot of beautiful basket weaving and mat weaving as well. And so some of her words when talking about these is that those baskets, they're so thirsty and that they need steam, water, whatever else in order to be able to function, sort of to remind them where they come from, that they're a tree. And so the same way you're going to want to water a basket. And so you have a similar situation with comics where there is a responsibility in the community and in the person making the work to have this cyclical sort of relationship where you have to be making things that are made in a good way, as in for the people that they're made for. And part of being in a good relation with everything as a person who makes comics, or as a creator in general, is that there is a utility and use for things in the community for the community. So if there's a message that you're getting across in your comic, you need to make sure that that is getting across to your community, because that's who you're going to answer to. And a lot of times stories that we end up using, there's a lot of misinformation that you really need to talk to the individual people that those stories are coming from. There's so many families that hold the stories, and there's a bunch of times where you're going to be told, I don't think this is something I should share with everybody. And that's just how it is. And there's similar way, there's a lot of objects, a lot of mats, for instance, in my community that they're not something that you're going to have like just on the floor. You're not just going to have it out. It's a specific use for that. And similar to that, there's a lot of options for indigenous groups to have intra-community conversations in media, in comics specifically, about this is what I'm trying to say and we're trying to continue this for our people. So just keep in mind for later on in the talk that that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying that being in good relation with your community and with everyone else when you are starting to create work, and how that really does tie in a lot of ways to what would be more considered, I guess, real Native American art, because there are a lot of conversations around, oh, this is what kind of a basket you would make if you were Ojibwe or Potawatomi, and oh, this is clearly such and so kind of sash, that sort of thing. But whenever you are making an object and you're Native, that is Native American art. And so that's sort of where I've been trying to push the conversation with some of my work and helping other folks get their stuff out there. And so that's another part of being part of that community, that by answering to your community, those are the people that are going to say this is authentic, whatever that word means, that specific person. And obviously, you don't have to agree with every single person, but you do have to think on the words that other people are giving to you, because that is a gift. When you do get critiqued by your community, it sucks. It absolutely sucks, and I hate it. But it is so important that people are willing to sit you down and talk to you and say, I think this could be better. And that is one of the most important parts of being better at any art, whether it's comics, basket weaving, anything else. Okay, so moving on to a different section, I want to talk about utility. So when we talk about baskets, obviously the utility is pretty obvious. You are using it for a reason, whether it's to pick something up, gather medicine, something like that. So I don't feel like I need to explain what a utility of a basket is too much. But we do have a similar situation that comes out of comics because they are often also used. So there's a utility there to convey emotions and messages across really huge distances. And so one of the, I guess, biggest effects of comics being a utility that you can use to convey messages has been the Marvel Comics universe, and obviously all those have been turned into movies. Not all of them, they're getting through them, right? But you do have so many of these getting made, and a lot of them are coming from a really, really specific worldview where generally everyone in the writer's room is going to be white. Everyone who is doing the rewrites for the screenplay is also going to be white. They've been working in some more diverse characters, but a more diverse character doesn't really mean that you have a more diverse writing room. And so because of that, you have messages that are being gotten across, whether it is in just the comic or in the movie that comes out of the comic. And whether or not that is a good thing, that is what's happening right now, is a completely different conversation. But because of that, you have people that are pushing for high militarization or for police brutality, working these kinds of messages into comics. And generally, I personally just ignore most of the, what would be considered the really big comics. Like, I have no interest in ever reading Captain America. That's not something that is ever going to speak to me. But these are still what are going to be, if you go to a comic book store, the ones that are getting ordered. It's been a kind of an ebb and flow as all these indie comics have been coming in, all these new voices and new messages getting across. But generally, there's not going to be anything you can do about Marvel and DC being the big ones. And those are the voices are going to be getting heard, sort of like I was talking about before. So these people who are making these things, they know what the utility of that is, because the utility of this comic has made them a lot of money. And they've become very good at setting up these comics in a way that gets across the message quickly, and you get it out on the shelf, people are buying it, they're fans, and now they're going to buy all the merchandise that will continue to let them make that. So there's different things that we can kind of do with digital platforms in order to be able to do a similar thing and be able to use that utility of comics. And I have some different links that I'll probably put down in the description for different places that things can be posted, some ideas on how to get word out for different programs and whatnot through zines and comics. But basically it comes down to, you have to really know who are you trying to tell your story to, and what is the very best way to do that. And so the parts that are going to make up a comic, they're going to be your illustration, your color, the format, and all these are going to be what has the utility to carry the messages. And so kind of like with splints with a basket, those ends, knots and twine, everything else that makes up the utility of a basket that is going to hold together for years and hopefully decades, you are going to have to really think about the way that illustration, color, format, everything else is working together to get across that message as quickly as possible, or not as quickly as possible. And there are all different kinds of comics, and with the huge boom of indie comics we've been seeing right now, you have all of these opportunities for maybe stories that they're not supposed to go anywhere. And that's okay. And I've seen a lot of comics that are starting to use unconventional materials, whether that's collage or just doing every single thing in crayon, something like that. There are those kinds of opportunities, and there's different things that that media is going to say to the viewer. But the most important thing you have to kind of keep in mind is, what are we saying? Is it obvious enough to get across to the community I'm trying to talk to? And is it useful to the community it's trying to talk to? Of course, not every single thing has to be useful, but you're still going to say something no matter what you do. So it may as well do something for the home community you're making it for. So for instance, I know it would be kind of difficult for a lot of people to think of say, an erotica comic to be that important or that useful to a community. But if you're talking about sexuality and sex in a way that is uplifting and is destigmatizing, whether it's like sex work or something else, it's important to have conversations no matter what that conversation is. And there's a lot of things that you can do, even in what we consider more silly kids comics, to not necessarily beat people over the head with this is what I'm trying to say, but no matter what you say, you're going to be coming at it from the history that you personally have with that issue, and knowing that going into it is so important. So part of doing the work is knowing where the work is going and who's going to be seeing it. And obviously you don't want things to be taken out of context, but I think that always keeping in mind the people that you're making it for are the people that it's important to. That is what is going to make sure that it is good in terms of a utility, in terms of an art object that can be experienced by those people. And not all the baskets are perfect, not all comics are perfect. Some are going to convey it better than others. You live and learn. That's just how it goes. So my next topic was on the selfhood of objects. So this is sort of a callback to my many issues in the museum. And just to give you some context on that, I do have an entire bachelor's degree in museum studies. So art history, museum studies concentration. And that was sort of where I had originally seen myself going. And to take you back in the past to baby Eli, I didn't care about comics. When I was growing up, it was extremely denigrated. And it, hilariously now to me, it's denigrated in a very specific way in my super Christian, we're going to pretend we're not Odawa household, to how baskets were treated. And I've never been able to understand if it was a very specific, like, 90s thing. I remember being a child around like 7 years old and constantly hearing all of these different movies be like, oh, underwater basket weaving. And I remember going, that sounds kind of cool, but no, that's not a thing. They were just making fun of basket weaving, and this is kind of upsetting at the time. But yeah, so you have all of these different issues that come out of obviously the background you're coming from. And part of the background I came from was I was convinced that real art meant fine art. I was from this little peanut farming town south. I didn't have a lot of experiences that I was allowed to have on my own. It was going to take me another 7 to 10 years to figure out that I was anything approaching not a little straight girl. I know, but so that was sort of the situation I was coming from, and I was convinced that if I wanted to be an artist, that meant I had to be an oil painter, I had to have gallery shows, I had to do the whole thing. And that's simply not how it is. And fantastic that I'm not relying on gallery shows now, to be honest, because I don't think anyone's going to too many galleries right now, which is upsetting because I kind of miss it, but you know. So that was the situation that led to me getting into museum work. And I bring this up because it is actually really important to what happened to me in terms of art and how I ended up seeing comics and basket weaving sort of intermixing in that way. So the way that art history, I guess we have to call it Western art history, what people call art history is very, very set on talking about dead white guys. And so I had to learn a lot about all of these terrible dead white guys who had done terrible things during their lives, but they still got propped up as these great people because, but look at the painting they made. And so that sort of started leading me down the line of, okay, so if I have to be taking these classes, I want to take as many Indigenous related art history classes as I possibly can. And one of those things was a class that was specifically on ceramic ware, which was not exactly ceramic ware, pottery making, that sort of thing, and all of these things. And it was okay. It was the worst possible situation in which to learn it because it was this crotchety little old man that was mad at me all the time. but that was the situation I had to be in order to take classes about that. So it made me start questioning, okay, so there are no mention on any of my classes of Odawa people. So when they say this is going to cover Native American art, it clearly doesn't. And you really could have a Native American art class that covered everything. So because of that, I started to question the work I was doing with the museum system, because I was actually working with Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, and I had been working in their education department and started to see that, okay, well, when we say that this is what art is, that is already a loaded concept. And then once I started to think about the way that certain art gets to be real art, and comics obviously in general, like maybe some people do, they're not considered real art. There's some places that have collections of them, and there's ones that are considered good, and they're not like those other comics that are bad. But for instance, you're never going to see, you might, but generally you're not going to see a zine that is about rebelling against fascism be in a museum collection. So that's going to tell you like the kinds of wants and needs that the people that are directing what real art is are going to tell you. And so I started running into the same situation where I was seeing these parallels between comics and between basket weaving, because it was similarly denigrated and put into this other little category of, oh, isn't it nice that they used to do this, instead of, oh, it's that kind of art. So it was in a museum, but it was in a museum as a form of control and telling people this is what makes this and this is why we are better. And so I started wanting to question that. So that started me sort of down this line of thinking about how we can create different media that is going to question what art can be. And oddly enough, since going down that, I've started having a couple of gallery shows, which with the work I had been making before I never would have. And it's been sort of an odd switch, because you've been seeing in the indie comic sphere and in more small gallery spaces that there is this movement towards these other narratives and talking about what does it mean when something is good art, and what does it mean when it sucks? And is that important? And it's just something museums are never going to be able to keep up with, because they are invested in telling a narrative about winning America. And so because of that, I would just say anyone who is interested in museum work, I am so proud of you. I hope you have a great time. I hated it. And I hope my family doesn't see this, because I know they're so very disappointed in going to museum work, but it wasn't for me. It just made me depressed. So there's that. So along with talking about how museums deal with art and how they feel about Indigenous people through the wording they use to talk about our art and our art objects, it's something that we have to keep in mind that each person is going to have their own experience with whatever that art object is. So taking us entirely out of the museum space, away from all of the Carnegie halls and all of that garbage, let's think about the way that people interact with comics and with baskets. So when you are touching and when you are moving those pages, similar to when you are holding a basket, you're going to have a really sensory experience. And so you can change different things, obviously, based on the way ink is used, and if there's like an overprint, that sort of thing. But the most important thing is the interaction that someone is going to have with that. And part of respecting that experience is respecting the experience of how that basket got made and how that comic got made. So you're going to be taking care of a basket and reminding it that it's a tree through water and steam, like we talked about. And so you're going to have to do it in the same way with comics, because you have to make sure they're being cared for by a community that is incubating new art and making sure that the stories that we're telling about ourselves and to each other, that those are being collected and cared for, and that we're not gatekeeping knowledge. Obviously, not all knowledge is for everyone. I'm never going to argue that, because that's simply not the case. But when we make comics, especially anything that relates back to indigenous sovereignty, heritage, and culture, you're going to want to make sure that when there's someone that is making this new kind of cross-media thing, where if you're doing a comic about that, it needs to be respected and accessible to the widest amount of people in your community, however that has to happen. There's different conversations you can have about that, about how do you make a digital library but not have it accessible to people outside the community. And honestly, that's not my area. I don't know about that, but those are hugely important community conversations that we need to be having. And part of understanding the selfhood of those objects is that they need to be respected how they are, where they are, and if that has been made in order to give back to a community, if we aren't making it accessible to its community, then we're doing a huge disservice to the object itself, let alone the person that made it. So again, like we talked about before, what stories are being told and what aren't being told, and how do we begin to tell those. And so that does actually still come into the selfhood of those objects, because if we aren't making sure that the artists and the people that are out there that are trying to tell these stories can do them, then we are just getting rid of the ability of these objects to ever exist. So what one thing I came across in some research about all these concepts around like sovereignty and everything else and returning is that a woman named Wendy Genesis, I'm so sorry, I'm probably terrible at that name, but Wendy came up with a couple different folks this term that is called, and I'm going to do my best to say it right, Biskabian, and it means returning to ourselves. And returning to ourselves as in knowing that there are a lot of things in these colonized spaces, especially academia, especially the art world. I can't stress enough, the art world tends to be terrible, so prepare yourself for that. But by moving outside of this colonized, correct way of doing things, of knowing things, we can look at the knowledge that has gotten decoupled and separated from the culture in which it was created, and you can return to the original people, and that is through reinterpretation and regeneration of those ideas. So it doesn't necessarily mean we want to go back to the past, and there's some ways in which we can do that, and there's some ways that that is the most respectful way to take care of these terminologies and knowledges, but it doesn't have to be. So you don't have to feel like you have to go all the way back to the butt. Like, it's not always what you are meant to do, and that's not always the skill set that you've been given. But what we can do is apply that same knowledge to today, and that is one of the most important ways, I think, to respect the knowledge of our ancestors, is to know that we can't recreate the world they lived in, but we can take the knowledge that they had and that they saved for us and make sure that we're applying it to the world we live now in order to do the best for our community, because that's part of being the good ancestors that we're going to eventually be. And so, and even if you feel like you've been doing it wrong so far, and there's not really a wrong way, there's just a way of learning. So just keep in mind that part of being respectful to the objects, to what they come from, and in a way both are coming from trees anyway, so being respectful to all the different living beings is that you need to know that your community is going to be what is going to keep you in check. You need to be in contact with that community, and you have to respect the knowledge that you've already been given by your ancestors by applying it to what you're making now. Okay, so obviously there has been a lighting change. I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. I had to take a break during the middle of this because my landlord had a ton of yard work being done, and the guy was playing the loudest radio I've ever heard in my life. I couldn't hear myself think. I don't know if you can hear it at the end, but I'm going to do my best to edit that post. Anyways, So the last section that I wanted to talk about is something that I've been referring to as just to encapsulate everything, the way things happen. So that sounds super, super negative if I just say it out of context like that, but stick with me, I promise it's going somewhere. So one of the ways that my grandma would always talk about the way that our lives were, the way they had been, is that she would say something called, well, not called, but the way she would say it is, some things you won't ever understand. And that wasn't meant as this negative thing. She was trying to get across that there is so much stuff that works into the way that we are, and that different things have happened. Different people, we will never have necessarily total knowledge of what happened to them. There's a bunch of people who have disappeared and didn't even get written down in history. There's so many different stories. There's specifically, even in my family, someone that we could probably now turn to spirit that had a husband and a wife and had this amazing life that we know almost nothing about. As entirely because of homophobia, transphobia, the whole thing. But it comes down to there is stuff that you need to come to terms with that you're never gonna get. And that's something that is really, really important to understand in terms of the way we make things. Because the way that comics get made, it's not going to be perfect. And you're not going to get to this point where you can sit down and just bang it out and it's perfect and nothing ever went wrong. Every single time there's going to be something weird that happens in the way things happen. So whether that's coming across the facts that you just aren't that good at drawing a face the exact same way every single time, so you need to adjust it, or the way that you draw trees and the way it was being drawn your last couple comics, and then this one that is a sequel, well, it doesn't really look like that now, so you're just going to have to roll with it. There's so many things that are going to be changing in the way that you're interacting with the media as well as the way people are interacting with it, and being able to respond to that and accept that the way things are going to happen isn't going to be something that you can tell it that this is what we're going to do now. So sort of the acceptance of that is something I've struggled with too, and I think it's just something good to kind of have in your mindset. So if you're able to move and adjust your skills, so that kind of goes back into being similar to basket weaving, where you can bend something, but you can't break it. So what I'm talking about is that if you're applying that to comics instead of, like with basket weaving, it would have been, did you take your splint? Did you make it wet? Did you push it too hard? Did you try to rework it? Okay, now you have a problem. So now you've made something that you've just wasted time on because you may not be able to make it be usable anymore. So that's something that's really important to be aware of as comic creators and as creators of all kinds, that if you have a skill set, no matter how good that skill is, no matter how amazing you are at that, if you just keep overworking yourself, and you have to really start thinking of yourself as one of your most important tools, at least that's what I have to do, because otherwise I will just work myself into there every single time. You have to realize if you break that tool, then it doesn't matter how good the rest of it was. You need to be able to bring it to that moment of completion, whatever that means, and it's not going to look the same for anyone, and it's not going to look the same from project to project. But if you're broken, if the way that you are working isn't working and it isn't healthy for you, then that's going to be the exact same as not doing it at all. So that's just something to keep in your mindset with. Yes, there are the ways certain things happen, and you need to kind of roll with it. Not force everything to happen a certain way, and not force yourself to hurt yourself in order to get done the work that you feel like you have to do. So another thing to keep in mind with the way that these two different kinds of media work together is that there's patterns that you weave, right? And this is of course true in basket weaving. We'll get into it with comics in a second. But if you look at the basket's body, that's going to be the iconography of whatever community that's coming from. So if you're looking at that from the standpoint of the way that this has been moved, whether it's the twine or the splint within the basket, the way that everything has been built up, that is based on a history and an iconography of this is how it looks. So you have a really similar thing in comics where you are going to be telling your personal iconography based on the stories and histories that come before you and what your experiences are. And that can be anything from the things that you've read and what you like, things that you're interested in, all that's going to inform the kind of work you're doing. So saying that this is the iconography that I personally have, that's going to have everything to do with whether your community puts sweetgrass edging on a basket or if you're drawing a cloud a certain way. And obviously this kind of gets into sort of weird territory where there's a lot of people that have the argument of, oh, this is just my style, and I've been seeing a lot more in more of the digital art spaces, not as much in comics. It's something I think is going to be filtering into that as we do continue having more people that are in indie that are talking about all these different experiences in comics, but specifically in digital art, talking about the way people are drawn. It's really important to keep in your head just that, yes, you may be drawing on something from your personal background, and it's okay if another person looks at it and it feels problematic to them. It doesn't mean that that was your intention, but you have to take that into consideration because the iconography you personally are working from is completely different from another person, and it's okay for them to have that different reaction to it. And it's just a matter of looking at what your intent was and what the outcome was. Always apologize. Don't be an asshole about it, which is my stance on most things in the digital art world. As we've been moving more and more online with coronavirus and everything, there's been a lot more art coming out, and a lot more people doing art about different people, and you can't really not talk about the entire thing happening with all the protests, Breonna Taylor, police brutality. There's so many people who are trying to just kind of capitalize on that, which I would say, don't capitalize on it, that sucks. But even so, there are going to be these kinds of conversations around, oh, okay, well, I think I want to draw these kinds of people. Even if you do come from the background of being indigenous and a person of color, it's important to really pay attention to when you are making something, are you still the right person to make it? And if you're not, who can you lift up to tell that story instead? And if you are and you're bringing something important to the table, then you really need to talk to all of your different communities and make sure everyone feels that everything's on the up and up, if that makes sense. So there's so many different ways things can get interpreted, especially out of context, and that can turn into an entire different conversation about Karens and everything else I'm not even going to touch right now. But it is really important to know that the way that you view the world won't be the same as the way someone else does, and that's okay. If they have a negative reaction to something you've made, it's not a negative reaction to you as a human being. Just figure out what you didn't manage to get across in your messages, in your work, and use that to move forward. Because it's always a call and response. That's just how the art world is, and that's how the communities are. And it doesn't need to be a end of the world thing if you get called out for something. Just take it and learn. So, okay, so kind of continuing on with that. So if we're going back to talking about baskets for a moment, the way that baskets can tell stories, those can be in a pattern, in a material you're using or what you're not using. In the case of black ash baskets that my family used to make, and it's been harder and harder. It's actually not something that they've passed down through the generations that I'm working on relearning and everything. But at this time, it's becoming harder and harder. So part of the story of that basket is why there's a certain material not being used. What if this basket would have been better if it was in black ash? Why is it not now? So that's part of that history and the story that's being told. And whether it's tightly woven or not, that could have something to do with the story of the basket and who was making it. Are they newer to making it? Have they been doing it for a while? Was it done more loosely for a certain purpose, or maybe not? And comics can do pretty much the same thing, where you're going to tell stories with characters, with the colors you're using or that you're not using, and the words you're using or not using. And I think that there's something really exciting about the way that people have been working with comics that don't necessarily have words, or they don't have color, or they move in some way outside of the way that comics are supposed to be. So I think that part of what we've been talking about with recontextualizing stuff for our own way is understanding that the medium that you're expected to use, whether that is digital or a print media, if it doesn't work for the story you're telling, or even if it does, but it doesn't feel right, just don't do that. There are a billion ways to make comics. You could do it in a way that it's not sculptural, that it's photographic, there's photo bashing, there's a billion different ways. So understanding your media, that's the beginning of where that story happens. And so being willing to really think about, why am I putting it in this space, even in the situation of webcomics? Is there something about the story that's being told by it being accessed in a digital way? Does that add something? Is there something you can do with the actual website itself that adds to that experience? And this example actually isn't even, it's not an Indigenous example, but is the work of someone I really respect. There is a webcomic called Superpose, and one thing I've really enjoyed about that is it's in a digital space on purpose. And what I mean by that is you can have a billion webcomics that it wouldn't really matter if you found it in a bookstore, in a little zine market, or if it's online. There's something really special about the way that you access this webcomic, where you feel like when you go to this homepage that you have been transported back to 1993, and horrible fashions are the best fashions, and all of the colors, it gives you that feeling. You immediately know where you are located narratively. And I think creating that space in a digital space is really important. And there's been so many different examples this year, from conventions to the way that people are expressing themselves, where in a 3D space you can have a interaction with a piece of art and with like those art objects we were talking about. Why are we not doing something like that? I mean, it's kind of corny when you have like, well, it's a webcomic and you're turning the pages and it's a 3D model. Like, okay, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, what ways can you make or give opportunities for your viewers and your community to interact with that in a way that feels different than if you were standing in front of them? So there's a billion different things we can do, and I'm not going to try to list them. I'm just trying to talk about some of the coolest stuff I've seen this year. But yeah, there's a lot of different opportunities for that, and really thinking about the media, especially in a digital space where there's so much opportunity for us to make what we want to see in the world in that way, you know. And there's definitely a lot of options in terms of how you're going to put that art out. And I mean, I can go on and on about that, but I'm going to just leave that for an entirely different talk. So, for all stories, we know that there needs to be a community and community care. And so when I talk about community care, I'm talking more about what we may have seen over the last couple months, talking about mutual aid. And so that means not just having one person that they're covering your dinner, you're going to get them back later, that sort of thing. It's more of a community scale where everyone has skills and they're all working together to create this thing, which is there's a lot of collaboration that goes along those lines in art, but it hasn't really pushed entirely into a care aspect where we aren't necessarily pooling resources to be able to help artists who are making the really, really good work be able to afford to just make the work. And that's something that we could be doing. Obviously, it's hard. No one has money right now, but there's ways of working around it. There's different ways to offer housing and opportunities to different people. And so part of knowing the way that it happened and the way that it is happening is that we have to understand how extremely, extremely important gifting is. And I don't just necessarily mean gifting comics or gifting a basket. Those are important things, and obviously there's different parts of the community all worked into that. It takes an entire community for a basket to get made, whether we're talking about the community of living beings that aren't human, water, trees, everything else like that, or we're talking about a comic where there's so much work and so many people have been teaching to lead to this person having the ability to make this comic. What I mean is that gifting needs to take the form of whatever is necessary for the community. And I can't tell you what that is going to be for yours. Every single comic is going to be different. Every kind of art, if you just want to apply to that, is going to be different. But what I mean is that when you have been given all of these gifts and all of these abilities to be able to actually make something, and even if it was just like a short little 3-panel comic, that's all you've done, but you actually did make it, you still made that. And that's amazing, and it's great, and it means that you are making comics. I do want to make that super, super clear. But that then means that you now have the responsibility to your community to make sure someone else can do that. Because for me at least, one of the most exciting things about comics is that you have these abilities to put your messages out into the world. With platforms like Itch.io, Gumroad, all of that, there's more and more people that are going to see your work than ever before. So you have these opportunities to say what you're trying to say, express it as well as you possibly can, and just get it out there. And that's amazing. But part of what you need to do then is find those young artists that are just starting out. I remember being a shady little teenager on the internet, and at one point my sister and I were like, we are going to make the coolest comic in the world, because we were crazy about Drunk Duck and everything else, like all of these comic websites. And rest in peace, Smack Jeeves. I'm very sad about it, but it's okay. So we were going to make the best thing in the world. And one thing that I ran into as this little teenager that was going to just do my best, and I knew the art wasn't the best thing in the world, but I was going to get it out there. It was going to be posted. Before I posted it to all the different comics platforms, I decided I was going to put up on this art sharing forum and see what people would say and how they felt about my work. And my sister had done all the writing, I had done the drawing and everything, and it was this whole collaboration thing. And the main person that commented on it and left multiple comments of paragraphs and paragraphs, completely ripped into it. Completely ripped into it, told me how terrible it was, how I wasn't a real artist, I was killing comics, like the whole thing. It was, for a 14, 15-year-old, that was the end of my world. So that is actually part of why I took so long to get back into comics. And it's weird because it's just the one person, right? And so you would think that the one person saying this wouldn't be the end of the world. Like, if you really care about comics, you get back into it. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe that was all you needed to say, I'm good, peace, get out of there. So it's really, really vital for our communities that instead of letting these youth that are starting to make the really important work just go online and get torn to shreds by people that can't appreciate where they're coming from, it's really, really important to find them and be able to help all of those ideas germinate and have them become the artists that they want to be. And so one of the ways to do that is, as a Indigenous comic artist, I want to do my best to reach out to the different people that are doing the work, but they are starting. They're just at the very beginning. And I want to make their life easier. I know that there's been all these conversations about, well, I went to art school and I had to get the loan, so I think they should too. And that's fine, but that sucks. Why would you think that? So what I'm saying is that if there's someone out there that you can help that person, because that is your community and that is your way of giving back. There's other ways to do it. There's definitely opportunities for things like different zine days, and something like that would be showing people how to make a zine, like even if it's one of the really, really tiny little mini zines you do with a single page, just showing them how they can create something, make it in one day, get their ideas out there, and it's in the world now. And that's even something that you can monetize too, which, and I think one of the most important things with people that are getting into this sort of art sphere is it's so scary to think about, I don't know how I'm going to pay rent. But there's ways of doing it. It's hard. I'm not going to lie. It's hard and it sucks. But there are ways of making it easier on yourself. And I really wish I had someone to show me all of these things when I was starting out, because there are ways I could have been making money when I was not a professional artist yet. I thought I couldn't do anything until I was out of school. Well, obviously that's not the case. And so part of taking care of that community is understanding that being a person that's in good relations with all of your relations and being even just a good neighbor, you need to make sure you are out there giving the opportunities to more people, passing whatever you can back to your community, and making their voices heard. So maybe that's going to take the form of doing a teaching day on this is how you make a comic. Let's make comics about all of the stories from our community, and we're going to print those up, actually make a real zine of it, digitize it and everything, and it's going to stay in the tribe library. And this is just going to be something that people can reference forever. And if it's in a digital state, then if it gets kind of torn up, kind of crappy, you can just remake it. So there's options like that. You also have the opportunity to, if you don't really feel like you can take on an individual student and be the person that they can, rely on for that kind of teaching, because that's not everyone's thing. There's a lot of opportunities within the community to just do single day classes, and whether you want that to be children only, mixed ages, that kind of thing. I think mixed ages is a little bit better. Because I personally think there's not a lot of opportunities for older artists that are really trying to start figuring out what they want to say. But I think if you are willing to sit down and really think about what are my skills, what can I give back, then that is going to get you pretty much to the point of actually helping the community. So basically, with all that said, that's basically what I was trying to get across with saying that a comic is kind of like a basket. I mean, they're not exactly the same, but a lot of the ways that we think about art, and we think about how things are created and when they get started and who gets to use them, that all really matters to the larger community and to your smaller community. So one of the most important things for me is that if we have something that we can make sure is helping the community, then you just need to spread that to as many people as possible. So I would say if you have any interest in comics, in basket weaving, in some kind of digital art, just if you have the time for it, please just try to find one person you can teach it to, because the ability of people to access this kind of information is so difficult. And for me at least, it was a matter of, honestly, just a couple $100 between me being able to make rent and me trying to figure out if I was going to have to live in my car. So there are more people that are in that situation than you know, but one of the great things about art and art creation is you don't necessarily need all of these things in order to make what you're trying to make and to make money with it. Just for instance, I at one point was complete and honest truth, I was homeless and I was creating art for an app. It doesn't sound like it's possible, but those people are out there. So really take stock of your community, listen to what they're saying. If they sound like they're not having a great time, it is worse. I promise you it is worse. So really taking care of the people that especially are the youth that want to create that work, that is what is most important. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I know I went off on a billion different tangents, and I'm so sorry, that's just who I am as a person. But yeah, this was Can a Basket Be a Comic? And I hope you all appreciate it, and I look forward to some community feedback. Alright, negócio dizendo aí, Galaman, negócio.